Good evening, I'm the drowsy historian, and tonight we'll journey into the world of the Scythians. There is a road that was never truly a road, no single path, no paved highway, no sign to guide the traveler. And yet for more than 1,000 years, it connected the farthest corners of the known world, carrying not just goods, but ideas, religions, languages, diseases, and dreams across mountains, deserts, and seas that most people believed no one could cross. We call it the Silk Road. And the story it tells is in many ways the story of civilization itself. Chapter 1. The World Before the Road. To understand what the Silk Road was, we must first understand the world it was born into. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, the great civilizations of the ancient world were largely strangers to one another. China, under the Han dynasty, was a powerful, sophisticated empire, already home to more than 50 million people. Its court was magnificent, its armies disciplined, its scholars prolific. But beyond the western horizon, beyond the Taklamakan Desert, beyond the Pamir Mountains, China's knowledge of the world grew thin and fanciful. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean basin, the Roman Empire was ascending. Rome's legions marched across 3 continents. Its merchants traded grain, wine, glass, and wool across a web of ports and roads that stretched from Britain to Egypt. But Rome's eastward gaze did not reach far. The lands beyond Parthia, the Empire of Persia, were little more than rumor. Between these 2 titans of the ancient world lay an immense, forbidding geography. The steppes of Central Asia, the Hindu Kush Range, the Karakum and Taklamakan deserts, the roof of the world on the Tibetan plateau. These were not places that invited travel. They were places that killed travelers, and yet people crossed them anyway. Nomadic peoples, the Scythians, the Sogdians, the Yuezhi, the Xiongnu, had lived on the steppes and desert edges for centuries. They moved with the seasons, knew the water sources, understood the winds. They were the first living threads in what would become a vast network of exchange. It was not merchants who opened the Silk Road. It was a diplomat on a desperate mission. In 138 BCE, the Han Emperor Wudi sent an envoy named Zhang Qian westward with a single task: find the Yuezhi people who had been pushed west by the Xiongnu and form a military alliance against China's enemies. Zhang Qian was captured almost immediately. He spent a decade in captivity among the Xiongnu. When he finally escaped, he pressed on westward rather than turning home, crossing the Ferghana Valley, reaching Bactria, the great city of Samarkand, the lands of Parthia. He found the Yuezhi, but they had no interest in war. They had settled into comfortable prosperity and forgotten their grievances. Zhang Qian returned to China after 13 years, his diplomatic mission a failure. But the information he carried back was priceless. He described fertile lands to the west. He described magnificent horses, tall, powerful animals so different from Chinese breeds that the emperor called them heavenly horses. He described cities, markets, peoples, and trade goods that no Chinese court had ever heard of. Emperor Wu Di was electrified. Within a generation, Chinese expeditions were pushing westward, not just in search of alliances, but in search of those extraordinary horses, in search of trade, in search of the world Zhang Qian had glimpsed. The Silk Road had its first footprints. Silk, the fabric that moved the world. But why silk? Of all the things China could have offered the world, porcelain, tea, bronze, knowledge, Why does this particular fabric give the road its name? The answer lies in mystery, monopoly, and desire. Silk is one of the most extraordinary materials human beings have ever produced. Woven from the filaments of the silkworm, the larva of the moth Bombyx mori, a single cocoon can yield between 300 and 900 meters of continuous thread. Silk is lighter than almost any other fabric. It is strong, it breathes, it shimmers, it catches light in a way that no other material could match in the ancient world. When Romans first encountered silk garments, they were so sheer, so lustrous, so impossibly fine, that Roman senators debated whether they were decent to wear, and China held the secret of its production with extraordinary ferocity. Sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms and the harvesting of their threads, had been practiced in China for at least 4,000 years by the time the Silk Road began. The process was complicated, meticulous, and carefully guarded. Silkworm eggs, mulberry seedlings, and the knowledge of how to turn a cocoon into a thread were all considered state secrets. The penalty for attempting to smuggle silk production knowledge out of China was for a long time death. The Romans had no idea where silk came from. They called the people
who made it the Seres, the silk people, and imagined them combing the material from the leaves of a mysterious forest. The truth that it came from an insect would have seemed too strange to believe. This mystery amplified silk's value enormously. In Rome, at the height of the trade, raw silk was worth its weight in gold. The Emperor Aurelian, in the 3rd century CE, famously refused to buy his wife a silk robe because the cost was too extravagant even for an emperor. Silk was used as currency. It was given as gifts between emperors. It was buried with kings. In China, silk was also far more than a fabric. It was payment. Government officials received their salaries partly in silk bolts. Soldiers were rewarded in silk. Silk was used as a diplomatic tool, sent to the nomadic peoples of the steppes as tribute, as payment for peace, as tokens of alliance. The Han court sent enormous quantities of silk westward every year, not because they wanted to, but because it was cheaper than fighting. In this way, silk didn't just travel the road, it helped create it. The demand for silk in the West was so powerful that it drove merchants to undertake journeys of extraordinary danger and length. It drew trade networks into contact with one another, link by link, oasis by oasis, until a chain of commerce stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And over time, other goods joined silk on the road. From China flowed porcelain, delicate, white, and utterly unlike anything produced in the West. Spices from Southeast Asia, lacquerware, iron, paper, one of China's most transformative inventions. From the West came gold, silver, and glassware, ivory from Africa, linen from Egypt, wine from the Mediterranean, horses from the Ferghana Valley, those heavenly horses, making the journey east. From India came cotton textiles, pepper, and the teachings of the Buddha. From Central Asia came lapis lazuli, that brilliant blue stone, and the skilled merchant people who would become the true masters of the road. The Sogdians, masters of the road. If the Silk Road had a people, they were the Sogdians. Today, their homeland is divided between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, a landlocked, arid region that sounds like the last place you'd expect to produce the world's greatest merchants. But for nearly a millennium, from roughly the 4th to the 9th century CE, The Sogdians dominated overland trade across Eurasia with a skill and sophistication that has few parallels in history. The Sogdians were an Iranian people, speakers of an Eastern Iranian language, centered on the great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. They were not nomads, they were city builders, farmers, and above all, traders. From a young age, Sogdian boys were trained for commerce. Ancient texts describe a custom in which a boy's lips were smeared with honey and a stylus placed in his hand so that he would speak sweetly and write cleverly, the two skills a merchant needed most. By the time a Sogdian young man was in his teens, he might already have set out on his first trading journey, heading east into China or west toward Byzantium. What made the Sogdians so extraordinarily effective was not just their courage or their business acumen, it was their network. The Sogdians established trading colonies across the entire length of the Silk Road. In every major city, in Dunhuang, in Chang'an, in Merv, in Ctesiphon, there were Sogdian communities linked to one another by language, family ties, and letters. They sent each other intelligence about market conditions, political stability, the safety of routes, the prices of goods. Their letters, some of which have survived miraculously in the dry desert air and were discovered in an ancient watchtower near Dunhuang in 1907, read with striking modernity. They complain about late payments. They warn of political unrest. They discuss prices and profits. They are, in short, the business correspondents of a sogdian mercantile civilization. One famous letter, dated to around 313 CE, was written by a Sogdian merchant named Nanai Dat. He describes in language that makes the chaos of his moment vivid across 17 centuries the collapse of order in China after the fall of the Western Jin dynasty. The last emperor, he writes, has fled. The city of Luoyang has burned. The Chinese are eating each other. His trading partners have not sent payment. He is stranded, uncertain, waiting. The letter was never delivered. It was found sealed in its bundle, never opened, 1,600 years later. The Sogdians were also religious pluralists of a remarkable kind. They were Zoroastrians by heritage, but they embraced Buddhism, Christianity, and Manichaeism with equal pragmatism, adopting the faith of whatever community they traded with. Their art, vivid narrative full of feasting, hunting, and mythological scenes, was found from the walls of Afrasiab, ancient Samarkand, to the caves of Dunhuang, a span of 5,000 kilometers. They were also linguistic chameleons. Sogdian became for several centuries the lingua franca of the Silk Road, the language in which merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims from different cultures communicated. Their alphabet, adapted and passed along, would eventually give birth to the writing systems of the Uyghurs, the Mongols, and the Manchus. The Sogdians did not just carry goods, they carried culture, faith, and ideas invisibly, ceaselessly across the width of a continent. When the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries swept across Central Asia, the Sogdian world was absorbed into a new order. Samarkand and Bukhara became Islamic cities. The Sogdian language faded. The communities in China diminished. By the 10th century, the Sogdians as a distinct people had largely vanished from history, but the road they had built, the connections they had woven did not disappear. They were simply inherited by others. The Oasis Cities, islands in a sea of sand, the Silk Road could not have existed without the oases. Across the vast deserts of Central Asia, the Taklamakan, the Karakum, the Kizilkum stretched hundreds of kilometers of lethal emptiness. No water, no shade, no food. Temperatures that swung from scorching summer heat to killing winter cold. Sandstorms that could bury a caravan alive. Travelers crossing these deserts moved from oasis to oasis, the way a sailor moves from port to port across an ocean. Miss an oasis and you died. And so the oasis towns grew into cities, not because of what they produced, but because of where they sat. Dunhuang, at the western edge of the Gobi Desert in western China, was a gateway to the Taklamakan. Every caravan heading west out of China stopped there. Every caravan arriving from the west ended its desert journey there. The city swelled with merchants, monks, soldiers, and officials. Its caves, the Mogao Caves, carved into a cliff face beginning in 366 CE, became one of the great repositories of Buddhist art and manuscript culture in the world. Today they contain tens of thousands of scrolls, paintings, and sculptures preserved by the desert air, a library of the Silk Road's spiritual life. Kashgar, at the western end of the Taklamakan, was where the northern and southern routes around the desert met. Here, the caravans that had skirted the desert's edge on either side converged in a market that became legendary across Asia. Kashgar's Sunday Bazaar, still functioning today, though transformed, drew traders from across Central Asia for centuries. If Dunhuang was the entry gate, Kashgar was the crossroads. Samarkand was perhaps the most magnificent of all the Silk Road cities. Situated in the Zarafshan River Valley in what is now Uzbekistan, it was old when Alexander the Great passed through it in 329 BCE and called it more beautiful than I had imagined. Rebuilt and burned and rebuilt again across the centuries, Samarkand was a city of extraordinary vitality, a place where Persian, Greek, Sogdian, Turkish, and Chinese influences mingled into something new. Under the Timurid ruler Tamerlane in the 14th and 15th centuries, it would become one of the most magnificent cities in the world, its mosques and madrasas covered in the brilliant blue tile work that still makes it breathtaking today. Merv, in modern Turkmenistan, was another critical node, a sprawling oasis city that for centuries ranked among the largest urban centers on Earth. At its height in the 12th century, Merv may have had a population of over 500,000 people, rivaling contemporary Constantinople or Baghdad. It was a city of libraries, scholars, and trade. When the Mongols destroyed it in 1221, they reportedly killed more than 1 million people, one of the most catastrophic acts of violence in the medieval world. Bukhara, Turfan, Khotan, Balkh, each name carries the weight of a civilization. These cities were not passive waypoints, they were dynamic centers of culture, scholarship, and production. Khotan was famous for its jade and later for producing its own silk. After, according to Chinese legend, a princess smuggled silkworm eggs in her headdress when she left China to marry a Khotanese king, a story that marks one of the first breaks in China's silk turfan, in a depression in the Gobi Desert, benefited from a remarkable underground irrigation system, the Karez or Kanat, that brought snowmelt from distant mountains under the desert floor to the fields and gardens of the city. This technological marvel allowed turfan to grow grapes, cotton, and grain in a place that receives almost no rainfall. Dried fruits and raisins from Turfan were traded across the Silk Road for centuries. The Oasis Cities were also places where religions met and contested for souls. Buddhism came east along the road from India, carried by monks who walked thousands of miles. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who traveled to India in the 7th century to collect Buddhist scripture, to travel account, the Great Tang records on the Western regions, that is one of the most remarkable documents of the Silk Road era. His journey inspired the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West, which would eventually give the world the character of Sun Wukong, the Monkey King. Zoroastrianism, Christianity in its Nestorian form, Manichaeism, and Islam all moved along the same road, carried by merchants and missionaries, winning converts in cities and courts across the continent. The Oasis Cities were where this spiritual commerce was conducted. Temples, monasteries, churches, and mosques rose side by side. Paintings on cave walls mixed Buddhist, Christian, and Zoroastrian imagery in ways that show how porous the boundaries between faiths could be. A merchant might pray at a Buddhist shrine in the morning and light a Zoroastrian fire in the evening, not from confusion, but from a pragmatic embrace of spiritual insurance. The Maritime Silk Road. The story of the Silk Road is not only a story of deserts and camel caravans. From at least the 1st century CE, a parallel network of maritime trade connected China, Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa in an exchange as rich and consequential as anything that crossed the steppes. The Maritime Silk Road, sometimes called the Spice Route, made use of the monsoon winds, a technology of navigation that transformed Indian Ocean sailing. The monsoon blows reliably northeast in winter and southwest in summer. Arab, Indian, and later Chinese sailors learned to harness these seasonal winds to make predictable, long-distance voyages that would otherwise have been impossible. A merchant leaving Aden in the Arabian Peninsula with the winter monsoon could reach the coast of India in weeks. The summer monsoon would bring him home. The trade goods of the maritime route were, in some ways, even more exotic than those of the overland road. Spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, moved from the spice islands of modern Indonesia through Indian middlemen to Arab traders to Mediterranean markets, each transaction multiplying the price. The Roman Empire hemorrhaged gold eastward in exchange for spices and silks, a flow of precious metal that alarmed Roman economists and moralists alike. From East Africa came ivory, gold, and slaves. From India came cotton cloth, indigo, teak, and precious stones. From China came porcelain, the fine white ceramic that Arab traders called chini, giving it the name we still use in many languages today. The cities of the Maritime Silk Road were as cosmopolitan and complex as any on the overland route. Calicut, on the Malabar coast of India. Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Aden, at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Malacca, commanding the strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. Quanzhou, the great port of southern Song dynasty China, where a Muslim cemetery from the 13th century still stands, testament to the Arab merchants who settled and died there. The greatest maritime power of the Silk Road era was perhaps the Song dynasty China of the 10th through 13th centuries. Song China developed the magnetic compass, the watertight compartment in ship hulls, and advanced sail technology, and its merchants and officials pushed Chinese maritime activity far into the South China Sea and Indian Ocean. This culminated in one of history's most extraordinary maritime enterprises, the voyages of Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming dynasty dispatched a series of enormous naval expeditions under the command of Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan province whose father had made the pilgrimage to Mecca. Zheng He's fleets were vast. Some accounts list hundreds of ships, including so-called treasure ships of extraordinary size, crewed by thousands of sailors, soldiers, and officials. These fleets sailed to Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa, exchanging gifts, establishing diplomatic relations, and demonstrating Chinese power on a scale the world had never seen, and then abruptly it stopped. In 1433, following Zheng He's death, the Ming court reversed course. Confucian officials hostile to maritime commerce and foreign entanglement won the political argument. The great ships were left to rot. The records of the voyages were suppressed. China turned inward. 60 years later, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in India, opening the age of European maritime expansion. The world that Zheng He had touched would be reshaped by powers with very different intentions. The Pax Mongolica. When the road reached its peak in the 13th century, the Silk Road entered its most extraordinary and most terrible chapter: the Mongols. In the space of a few decades, the armies of Genghis Khan and his successors conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history, sweeping from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Western Europe. City after city fell. Before their advance, Samarkand, Bukhara, Baghdad, Kiev, Krakow, all destroyed or brought to submission. The Mongol conquests killed millions, destroyed civilizations, and ended the flourishing of cities it had taken centuries to build. Merv, as we noted, was essentially annihilated. Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate's capital and arguably the greatest city in the medieval world, fell in 1258. The Mongols killed the caliph, threw the priceless books of the House of Wisdom into the Tigris River, which, legend says, ran black with ink, and ended 5 centuries of Islamic Golden Age scholarship. The destruction was real and catastrophic, and yet, out of this destruction emerged something unexpected: the longest period of relative peace and connectivity that the Silk Road had ever known. The Mongol Empire, once consolidated, was, by its own brutal standards, remarkably tolerant of commerce, religion, and cultural exchange. The Mongol rulers needed trade. They needed craftsmen, scholars, physicians, and administrators. They prized merchants and protected them on the road. For roughly a century, from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, a single political authority, however loosely organized, controlled a vast swath of Eurasia from China to Persia. A traveler with the right documents could cross this expanse in relative safety. This era is known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Its most famous beneficiary was a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo. In 1271, Marco Polo left Venice with his father and uncle, traveling east along the Silk Road. He spent 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of China, traveling extensively through a China that no European had described in such detail. When he returned to Venice and later dictated his account in a Genoese prison, the book he produced, known variously as The Travels of Marco Polo or The Description of the World, was so full of wonders that many of his contemporaries disbelieved him. He described a China of astounding sophistication, coal burned for fuel, paper money used in commerce, cities of a scale and wealth that dwarfed anything in Europe, a postal relay system that allowed the Khan's messages to travel vast distances in days. He described the court of Kublai Khan in terms that made European readers' heads swim with envy and astonishment. Marco Polo was not the first European to travel to China. Franciscan friars had preceded him, but his account became the most widely read, and it shaped European imagination of the East for centuries. When Christopher Columbus set out across the Atlantic in 1492, he carried a copy of Marco Polo's book, annotated in his own hand. He was looking, in part, for the China Marco Polo had described. The Pax Mongolica also allowed something else to travel the Silk Road with terrible efficiency: the Black Death. In the 1340s, a catastrophic pandemic of bubonic plague erupted somewhere in Central Asia, most likely in the region around the Caspian and Black Seas. The disease spread westward along the Silk Road trading routes with extraordinary speed, reaching the Crimean city of Kaffa in 1346, where it infected Genoese merchants who carried it back to Italy and the Mediterranean. Within a decade, the Black Death had killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. Estimates range from 25 to 50 million dead. It devastated the Middle East and disrupted China as well. The Mongol Empire, already weakening from internal conflicts and succession struggles, never recovered. The extraordinary trans-Eurasian connectivity of the Pax Mongolica had enabled both the greatest flourishing and the greatest catastrophe of the medieval Silk Road. By the late 14th century, the road was closing down, the Mongol states fragmented. The safe passage of the Pax Mongolica ended. The Ottoman Empire rose to control the western end of the overland routes and imposed tariffs that made the overland trade increasingly expensive for European merchants. Europeans began to look for another way to reach the East. Throughout this story, we have spoken of silk, spices, porcelain, and gold. But the most consequential things that traveled the Silk Road had no weight at all. Ideas, technologies, religions, mathematical systems, artistic styles, musical instruments, agricultural crops, and diseases, which are, in their terrible way, also a form of biological information. Consider paper was invented in China, probably in the 2nd century CE, though legend attributes it to a court official named Kai Lun around 105 CE. For centuries it remained a Chinese secret, like silk. But during the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, a clash between Tang Dynasty China and the expanding Abbasid Caliphate, Chinese prisoners of war were captured, among them paper makers. Within decades, paper mills appeared in Samarkand. Within a century, Baghdad had them. Within 2 centuries, paper had reached Egypt. By the 12th century, it remained a Chinese secret, like silk. But during the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, a clash between Tang Dynasty China and the expanding Abbasid Caliphate, Chinese prisoners of war were captured, among them paper makers. Within decades, paper mills appeared in Samarkand. Within a century, Baghdad had them. Within 2 centuries, paper had reached Egypt. By the 12th century, it was being made in Spain. The consequences were enormous. Paper was cheaper, lighter, and more versatile than parchment or papyrus. It enabled the expansion of literacy, the preservation of knowledge, the development of bureaucracy, and eventually, once combined with movable type, another Chinese invention that traveled west, the printing press and the information revolution of the European Renaissance. The numerals we use today, the ones we call Arabic numerals, are themselves a Silk Road transmission. Developed in India, they were carried westward by Arab mathematicians and scholars who improved and systematized them. Medieval European mathematicians learned them from Arabic texts, often translated from earlier Indian or Greek works that had been preserved and extended in the great libraries of Baghdad and Samarkand. The zero, that conceptually revolutionary digit without which modern mathematics, science, and computing would be impossible, traveled this same route. The stirrup, that simple piece of metal that allows a rider to stand in the saddle and swing a sword, appears to have been developed in Central Asia and spread in both directions, to China and to Europe, with transformative consequences for warfare. Some historians argue that the stirrup made the armored cavalry charge possible, and that the cavalry charge eventually required the feudal system to sustain it, a direct technological line from a piece of metal on a Central Asian saddle to the social organization of medieval Europe. Gunpowder is another Chinese invention that traveled west, though its journey was slower and its effects when it arrived in Europe were devastating to the feudal order the stirrup had helped create. Musical instruments flowed along the road. The lute, that quintessential instrument of the European Renaissance, descended from the Arab oud, which itself derived from Persian and Central Asian antecedents. The rabab, the ancestor of the violin, traveled from Central Asia through Persia and the Arab world to medieval Europe. The percussion instruments of West African music carry traces of contact with Arab traders who crossed the Sahara, itself a kind of sand sea with its own routes of exchange. Crops moved along the road in ways that permanently transformed what people ate. Cotton, originating in India, spread westward and would eventually clothe much of the world. Citrus fruits, oranges, lemons, limes, moved from South and Southeast Asia through the Arab world to Europe, and then aboard European ships to the Americas. The sugarcane that built and destroyed so many lives in the Atlantic slave trade was a plant of Southeast Asian origin that traveled via India and Persia to the Arab world and then to the Mediterranean, and religion. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and China along the Silk Road, carried by monks and encouraged by merchants who found in Buddhist monasteries welcome rest stops and in Buddhist ideas a spiritual language that spoke across cultural boundaries. The Chinese Buddhist cave paintings at Mogao, Yungang, and Longmen, among the greatest artistic achievements of the medieval world, were inspired by artistic traditions that flowed in from Gandhara and beyond, themselves blending Greek, Indian, and Persian influences into something new. Nestorian Christianity, condemned as heresy in the West in 431 CE, survived and flourished along the Silk Road, establishing churches as far east as China. A remarkable stone stele discovered near the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an and dated to 781 CE records the arrival of Nestorian missionaries in China in the 7th century in both Chinese and Syriac. For centuries, there were Christian communities in China, a fact that astonished European missionaries when they arrived 1,000 years later. Islam, born in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE, spread with extraordinary speed along the Silk Road's networks. Arab armies conquered Persia, Central Asia, and North Africa within decades of the Prophet's death. But military conquest was only part of the story. Muslim merchants, scholars, and Sufi teachers carried Islam along trade routes into areas no army reached, into the Malay world, into sub-Saharan Africa, into China's interior. Today, more than 1 billion Muslims live in countries, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Malaysia, sub-Saharan Africa, that were reached not by conquest but by commerce. The Silk Road did not carry ideas passively. Every idea that traveled was transformed by the journey, reshaped by the cultures it passed through, combined with local traditions to produce something new. Buddhism in China is not Buddhism in India. Islam in Indonesia is not Islam in Arabia. The Silk Road was not a pipeline but a laboratory, a place where the raw material of human thought was constantly processed, mixed, and remade. The Silk Road today and tomorrow. In 2013, Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road. It is a web of roads, railways, pipelines, ports, and fiber optic cables connecting China to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, along routes that strikingly echo the ancient trade networks. New railways run from China through Kazakhstan to Germany. Ports in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and Greece have received Chinese investment. The ancient cities, Samarkand, Kashgar, Almaty, find themselves once again at the intersections of great power commerce. The initiative is deeply controversial. Critics point to debt dependency, Chinese geopolitical influence, and environmental costs. But the underlying logic, that the geography of Eurasia remains a geography of possibility, is the same logic that sent Zhang Qian west 2,000 years ago. Epilogue: what the road teaches us. There is a temptation to tell the story of the Silk Road as a simple tale of harmony and peaceful dialogue between East and West. But the reality was far more complicated and often far more violent. The road was built on the labor of slaves. It carried plague as readily as philosophy. Empires protected it for their own benefit. And yet, the Silk Road teaches us that connection is our natural condition, that human beings left to their own devices will cross any desert, climb any mountain, sail any sea, to find each other, to trade, to communicate, and to learn. That the borders we draw on maps are always more permeable than they appear. It teaches us humility. Every civilization thrived in part because of what it received from others. Chinese painting was enriched by Buddhist art from India and Iran. Islam preserved the mathematics of Greece and India. Europe's Renaissance was fed by texts kept alive in the libraries of Baghdad and Samarkand. The camel caravans are gone. The oasis markets have quieted. But the road is still here, in the genes of our culture, in the tools of our civilization, in the food on our tables, and the words in our languages.